Okay, so we all want to feel confident, in the medications that we use, that they're safe
Absolutely.
and that they're really, truly effective.
Right.
But have you ever really stopped to think about, like, all of the work that goes on behind the scenes to make that possible?
Yeah,
To be able to trust those medications?
100%.
Like all of the systems and the regulations?
Yeah,
And one of the most important sets of those standards
sure.
is current good clinical practices.
Yeah, we call those cGCPs for short.
Or cGCPs.
You'll hear us say that a lot.
Yeah, you'll hear us say that a lot. So we're taking a deep dive into that,
Yeah, it's a big one.
into that world today.
Absolutely. So this is really not just about like dry rules or
Right.
regulations.
Yeah.
This is really about the foundation
Yeah.
of how we actually conduct clinical trials.
Right.
And how we test these new treatments.
Right.
So we're going to unpack these core principles
Yeah.
of cGCPs.
Yeah.
And we'll highlight their really vital role
Yeah.
in protecting the people who volunteer
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
participate in research.
Right.
And also at the same time, making sure
Yeah.
that the data we get from those trials is reliable and robust.
Yeah. And to do that, we've got kind of a wealth of information in front of us here.
We do.
We're looking at a transcript
Yeah.
that's specifically dedicated to the foundations and the ethical principles
Very important.
of cGCPs.
Yeah.
We've also got excerpts from the Code of Federal Regulations.
Right.
That's the CFR.
Right.
And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the CFR,
Right.
that's basically like the rule book
Yeah.
of the federal government.
For the U.S.
From
government.
the U.S. government.
That's right.
It's where all the rules and regulations are published.
Exactly.
And these cover everything from how you manage electronic records to
Yeah.
the standards that we use for manufacturing
Yes.
and actually conducting clinical trials.
All in there.
It's all in there.
Yeah.
And we've also got some things from like books on GMP.
Yeah.
Good manufacturing practices.
Very important.
Quality systems.
Yeah.
We've got the ICH guidelines.
The international list.
The international guidelines.
Yeah, so these are guidelines that countries around the world use to harmonize
Yeah.
drug
yeah.
development.
Yeah.
It's really important for global trade and safety.
Yeah. And then we've got transcripts from YouTube videos
Oh, cool.
that kind of like break down GMP clinical trials, FDA regulations.
Nice, so we can get the perspective
Yeah,
of people explaining these things.
exactly.
That's really helpful.
And then we've even got like a report that analyzes findings
Oh,
from FDA inspections,
that's a good one.
which are known as Form 483 observations.
Yeah, those are the things that the FDA finds when they do an inspection.
Yeah.
And if you have 483 observations, that means you're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
Yeah.
Essentially.
So we're going to look at all those
Yeah.
to understand cGCPs better.
Yeah. So like our mission here is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, what is it?
We want to give you a clear understanding of what cGCPs are all about.
Yep.
We're going to explain why they're so important.
To everybody.
Yeah, to everybody.
Yeah.
And explore these really fundamental ethical and procedural elements that make them up.
The core of it.
Yeah, so let's just start with the basics.
Yeah.
What are cGCPs?
So basically cGCPs
Yeah.
are these internationally recognized standards.
Okay.
They're ethical and scientific quality standards
Yeah.
that govern how clinical trials are designed,
Okay.
how they're conducted, how they're recorded,
Yeah.
and how they're reported.
Okay, so it's like
It's the whole thing.
the rule book
It is the rule book.
for running a clinical trial.
It's the rule book for anyone involved in testing new medical treatments in humans.
Okay.
That's what it is.
So it's not just like a good idea.
No.
It's the standard
It's the standard.
that everyone's expected to follow.
Exactly.
Okay, so why do we have them?
Good question.
Like, what's the purpose?
So cGCPs serve two really critical purposes.
Okay.
First and foremost, they're there to protect people,
Okay.
the people who participate in the trials,
Okay.
their safety, their well-being, and their rights.
Okay.
That's the main ethical commitment.
Okay.
But equally important
Yeah.
is the role that they play in ensuring the quality of the data
Okay.
that comes out of the trials.
Right.
Because if we can't trust the data,
Right.
we can't trust any of the conclusions that are made about whether a treatment's safe and effective.
That makes sense.
Right. So it's all about protecting the participants
Yeah.
and making sure that the science
Yeah.
is sound
Is solid.
and trustworthy.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the GMP regulations before.
Yes, we have.
And I feel like that's probably a good place to start
That's a good connection.
with kind of putting this into a bigger picture.
Yes.
Like, how did we get here?
So GMPs
Yeah.
are all about the quality of drug manufacturing.
Right.
Right. Making sure that the drugs are made correctly. But cGCPs
Yeah.
are about making sure that the drugs are actually safe and effective
Right.
and that we're testing them in the right way.
Right.
So the history of GMPs can really help us understand how we got to this point
Okay.
where we care so much about ethics in research.
Okay.
So, we've talked about the thalidomide disaster
Yeah.
back in the 1960s,
Right.
where this drug was given to pregnant women,
Right.
and it caused really severe birth defects in their children.
Yeah, it was really
It
tragic.
was a huge tragedy.
Yeah.
And it really highlighted that, just making sure that the medicines were manufactured correctly wasn't enough.
Right.
We needed to actually make sure that they were safe and effective.
Before you give them to people.
Exactly, before you give them to people.
Yeah.
Especially vulnerable populations
Yeah.
like pregnant women.
Yeah.
So this tragedy was a major driving force
Yeah.
behind developing stricter regulations
Yeah.
that focused on patient safety and data integrity.
Oh.
So GMP ensures that medicine's well made.
Right.
cGCP ensures that we prove it actually works.
In humans.
In humans.
Yeah. And that it's safe.
Ethically and scientifically.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good distinction.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And it's a good reminder that these aren't just,
Yeah.
bureaucratic hoops to jump through.
Right.
These regulations exist
Yeah.
for a reason.
They exist because of very real
Yeah.
and serious consequences
Yeah.
that have happened in the past
Right.
when we haven't had these regulations in place.
Yeah. And when we haven't followed them.
Exactly.
So it's not just a checklist.
No, not a checklist.
No, it's more than that.
It's more about like a commitment to quality and
Focus.
ethics.
It's a commitment to building quality and ethical considerations into every single stage of the research process.
Yeah, and that's throughout the entire process.
From the beginning,
Yeah.
from the design of the study,
Yeah.
all the way through
Yeah.
to the reporting of the results. Yeah. Okay, so then what are the core ethical principles
Good questions.
that underpin cGCPs?
So there are a few really key ethical principles
Okay.
that guide all clinical research.
Okay.
And these are things like respect for persons,
Okay.
beneficence, and justice.
Okay, so let's talk about those.
Let's break those down.
A little more.
Yeah.
What does respect for persons actually mean?
So respect for persons means
Yeah.
that we recognize the autonomy of individuals
Okay.
and their right to make their own decisions
Okay.
about whether or not they want to participate in research.
Okay.
And we also have to protect those who have diminished autonomy.
Okay, so like people who can't.
Yeah, like children
Yeah.
or people with cognitive impairments.
Right.
They might not be able to make those decisions for themselves, so
Yeah,
you have
yeah.
to protect them.
Okay.
And this principle is really embodied in the idea of informed consent.
Informed consent.
That's a big one.
Yeah, it's a term we hear all the time
It is.
when we're talking about all the time medical research. Yeah. So what is that? Why is that so important?
Informed consent is basically
Yeah.
the process of giving potential participants
Okay.
all of the essential information
Yeah.
about a clinical trial.
Right.
So this includes things like,
Yeah.
what's the purpose of the trial?
Okay.
What are the procedures involved?
Yeah.
What are the potential risks and benefits?
Right.
And what other treatments might be available? And this information
Yeah.
has to be presented in a way
Yeah.
that the potential participant can understand.
Right.
So it has to be in their language. It has to be at their level of understanding.
Right.
And their decision to participate
Yeah.
has to be completely voluntary.
Right.
They have to be told that they can withdraw from the study at any time
Right.
without penalty.
Okay.
So it's not just a one-time signature on a form.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process.
It's ongoing.
Right.
Okay.
And that's really important.
So it's about really making sure that people can make informed decisions about their health.
It is about empowering individuals
Yeah.
to make choices about their own health.
Yeah.
And whether or not they want to be part of research.
Okay. So we've talked about the participants.
Right.
What about like the actual design of the study?
Yeah, that's a good point.
How does that impact the ethical conduct
Yeah.
and the quality of the data?
A well-designed protocol is super important,
Yeah.
not just for the ethics,
Right.
but also for the data.
Yeah.
So, if the protocol's not well-designed,
Yeah.
it can expose participants to unnecessary risks.
Right.
And even if it doesn't harm them,
Yeah.
it can lead to data that's unreliable.
Right. Or unusable.
Exactly.
So then what makes a protocol well designed?
Well, there are a few key elements
Okay.
that are really important.
Okay.
So first, you need to have clearly defined objectives
Okay.
and research questions.
Okay.
Like, what are we trying to learn? from this study.
Yeah.
You need to know that up front.
Yeah.
Then you need to have criteria
Yeah.
for who can participate in the study.
Okay.
These are called inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Right.
And these criteria
Yeah.
have to be scientifically sound,
Okay.
but they also have to be fair,
Right.
right? We need to make sure
Yeah.
that the burdens and benefits of research
Yeah.
are distributed equitably
Yeah.
across different populations.
Right.
So that's the ethical principle of justice,
Yeah.
right? Making sure that everyone has a fair chance
Yeah.
to participate.
Okay.
And then the protocol needs to provide
Yeah.
a very detailed description of all the study procedures.
Okay.
So that's things like,
Okay.
what are the interventions?
Right.
What are the doses?
Yeah.
What's the schedule of visits and treatments?
Right.
What assessments are we doing?
Yeah.
All of that stuff
Okay.
needs to be laid out in detail.
Yeah.
And then it needs to include a plan for safety monitoring.
Okay.
How are we going to identify adverse events?
Right.
How are we going to document them? How are we going to report them?
Okay.
And then finally,
Yeah.
you need to have a plan for the statistics.
Right.
How big is the sample size going to be?
Yeah.
How are we going to analyze the data?
Okay.
All of that.
Yeah. So you need to consider all that before you even start the trial.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
And if there are flaws in the protocol,
Yeah.
like if the safety monitoring is not adequate,
Yeah.
or if there aren't enough participants,
Yeah.
then it raises ethical concerns.
Right.
Because you might be putting people at risk.
Right.
But it also undermines the science
Yeah.
because the data might not be reliable.
Okay. So it's both ethical and scientific.
It's both.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
Well, okay. So let's move on to the data itself.
Okay.
How do cGCPs make sure that the data that we collect during a trial is high quality?
Right. So cGCPs really emphasize the importance of data quality
Okay.
and data integrity
Yeah.
throughout the whole clinical trial.
Okay.
So every aspect of how you handle that data
Okay.
from the very beginning,
Yeah.
when you collect it,
Yeah.
to how you analyze it
Yeah.
and how you store it,
Yeah.
has to be done with a lot of attention to detail
Right.
to make sure the findings are trustworthy.
Okay. So it's more involved than just like
Way more.
writing some numbers down
Yeah, it's not just about recording numbers.
on a piece of paper or in a
Yeah.
spreadsheet.
No, it's about making sure
Yeah.
that the data is accurate
Yeah.
and that it's reliable.
Okay.
And one of the key things is documentation.
Right.
So we've talked about good documentation practices before,
GDP.
GDP.
Yes. Yeah.
right? And those principles
Yeah.
apply here as well.
Okay.
So all records have to be legible.
Okay.
They have to be contemporaneous,
Yeah.
meaning you have to write them down
Yeah.
at the time that the event happens.
Right.
They have to be accurate.
Yeah.
They have to be original,
Wow.
and they have to be attributable.
Meaning, you know who did it.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about all the electronic data?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one these days.
Yeah, because I mean that's
Most data is electronic.
most data is electronic now.
Yeah.
So how do cGCPs like address that?
So the CFR has a whole section
Okay.
on electronic records and electronic signatures.
Okay.
It's 21 CFR, Part 11.
Part 11.
Part 11.
Okay.
And these regulations are there
Yeah.
to make sure that the data is authentic,
Okay.
that it's reliable,
Yeah.
that it's confidential.
Okay.
So you have to have things like
Yeah.
unique electronic signatures,
Okay.
audit trails,
Yeah.
so you can track any changes to the records.
Right.
And you have to validate the computer systems
Right.
to make sure that they're working properly.
Okay.
So it's a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah.
But the underlying principles are the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Accuracy, reliability, trustworthiness.
Okay. And then what about
That's the key.
like lab testing? Oh, yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah, because that's where we're getting
A lot of the data.
a lot of the data about
Yeah.
how the drug is working in the body.
So the integrity of lab testing
Yeah.
is super important
Yeah.
because it provides key data
Right.
that supports, the safety and efficacy
Yeah.
of the investigational product.
Right.
So here's where GMP comes in again.
Okay.
Right? Even though GMP is focused on manufacturing,
Yeah.
a lot of those principles
Right.
apply to lab testing as well.
Okay.
So things like having controlled processes
Okay.
and robust quality systems
Yeah.
and using risk management.
Right.
All of those things underpin the quality of the lab work.
Okay, and then specifically,
Right.
what kinds of things are we looking for?
So you need to have really good quality control procedures
Okay.
in the lab.
Okay.
So that means things like
Yeah.
using check standards
Okay.
to make sure that your instruments are calibrated correctly,
Right.
running blank samples to make sure there's no contamination,
Yeah.
establishing detection and quantitation limits.
Okay.
So you know how much of the drug you
Yeah.
can actually detect.
Right.
And then having data review processes
Okay.
where multiple people look at the data
Right.
to make sure it's accurate.
Okay.
So it's all about
Yeah.
making sure that the lab testing is reliable
Right.
and accurate.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a very interconnected system
Right.
where all these different regulations and guidelines
Yeah.
are working together.
To ensure quality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so then
But every step.
all of this stuff,
Yeah.
it's not just a good idea,
Right.
it's a requirement.
It is a regulatory requirement.
Right. So if you're
It's
doing
the law.
if you're doing a clinical trial,
Yeah.
you have to follow these rules.
You have to follow the rules.
Right.
If you want your data to be accepted
Right.
by the FDA.
By the regulatory authorities?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So it's not something to mess around with.
Right.
You know,
And what happens if you don't?
bad things.
Yeah, what are the consequences?
So the FDA does inspections
Right.
to check up on people
Yeah.
and make sure they're following the rules.
All right.
And if they find that you're not,
Yeah.
there could be some pretty serious consequences.
Like what?
Well, they can shut down your trial.
Oh, wow.
They could
Yeah.
reject your data.
Yeah.
They could delay your drug approval.
Yeah.
And they could even take other regulatory actions.
Like fines.
Yeah, fines, warning letters,
Yeah.
all sorts of stuff.
Okay,
So it's not something you want to mess with.
it's not something to take lightly.
No.
Yeah, so understanding cGCPs
Right.
really gives you a good look
Yeah,
into how medicines are developed.
exactly.
And all the work and the ethical considerations
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
that go into that.
And it's all for good reason.
Yeah.
Right.
So whether you're like preparing for a meeting
Yep.
or just trying to get up to speed
Or just curious.
in a certain area or just curious how it all works,
Right.
knowing these principles
Yeah.
really helps you appreciate how complex it all is.
It's very complex.
Yeah, and all the safeguards that are in place
Exactly.
to protect everybody.
All about protecting people.
Yeah. Okay, so just to recap,
Okay.
cGCPs are a set of international regulations
Yep.
based on ethical principles,
That's right.
and they emphasize protecting the participants in clinical trials
Yeah.
and ensuring the quality and the integrity of the data
That's right.
that's collected.
It's all about the data.
Yeah.
Right.
And so this is achieved through a
Right.
lot of hard work.
Yeah?
Designing the study protocol
Yes.
very carefully and ethically.
It's sticking to the standards.
And then following the standards
Yeah.
throughout the whole process.
From beginning to end.
Yeah.
It's a long process.
Okay, so basically, every medical breakthrough that we've ever seen
Right.
has been built on this foundation.
It all relies on cGCPs.
Of cGCPs.
Yeah. It's the framework for advancing healthcare responsibly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in learning more
Yeah.
about cGCPs,
There's a lot out there.
there is a lot of information out there.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you
Yes.
to look into the CFR
Yeah.
and the ICH guidelines.
Those are great resources.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail there.
There is. And it can be a little bit overwhelming,
Yeah,
but it's worth it.
but it's worth it.
If you want to really understand this stuff,
If you really want to understand it.
yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us
Thank you for having me.
on this deep dive
It's been a pleasure.
into cGCPs.
I hope you learned something.